There's nothing quite like the prospects of nuclear war to inspire a session of questions and answers. So let's get straight to it. The dispute over territory here is pretty clear. However, what is the bargaining friction? Well, I suppose that you could go through a laundry list of potential items that might be relevant to this particular situation. And just like any other conflict, asymmetric information is always a problem. But I think that there is something specific worth highlighting here, and that is not being sure who is responsible for what, and the private ability, the secret ability for one party to cheat on an agreement. To frame that within what's actually happening between India and Pakistan, obviously everyone observed that there was an attack inside of Kashmir that killed a lot of Indians. The question, though, that is pertinent to the broader bargaining situation is how much responsibility did Pakistan have for that attack? And even if Pakistan was not directly responsible, is it the case that Pakistani officials are not doing a very good job at policing their own individuals, or perhaps are they actively ignoring potential risks, knowing that they're not going to be attacking Pakistanis, they're going to be attacking Indians, and maybe it's not worth the Pakistani government's time to try to root out those sorts of problems. Now, if this conflict stretches out a longer period of time, one of the things that I have on my potential list of topics to do full-length videos on is the crisis bargaining scenario where this is the case and the implications therein. For now, though, let me just give you the broad overview of this. In your standard sort of crisis bargaining scenario, you try to settle around the expected outcome of the conflict with some margin of error, given that there are going to be costs that both sides would pay if they do fight. Well, if you have one party that is capable of privately cheating on the deal, in other words, you have an agreement on paper, but you can't directly observe in any given period whether it's being followed appropriately, the way that you have to combat that is to overpay the potential cheater. And I realize as I am saying that there's an obvious normative implication here that is pretty bad, that you have to overpay the person who could be cheating. You have to reward the person that might cheat on the deal. But that's just the fact of life. If you want to convince someone to not cheat on an agreement, the way that you have to go about doing that is to make the agreement look extremely attractive to them, so that if they are ever caught cheating on it, there is going to be a large punishment associated with that, namely reverting back to war and not having this really attractive deal from the perspective of the potential cheater. Well, as I note at the bottom there, under some circumstances, a settlement might not be possible. And if that's the case, and that is what we're observing right now, then the war that you'll end up seeing is one side, namely India in this case, fighting for long enough to convince itself that the possibility of secret cheating on the agreement is no longer feasible by the other side. And here, that would mean India destroys enough of the Pakistani militant group's infrastructure that India is satisfied that even if Pakistan's government is not fulfilling the basic requirements of sovereignty and policing its own soil by stopping those militant groups from attacking India, well, enough infrastructure is destroyed that those militant groups can't really cause very much damage. Is there an academic view that given the nature of the modern world, that enough regional conflict has to trigger a world war after hitting some unknown critical mass? That may be especially concerning given that conflict anywhere raises uncertainty, and therefore the chance of war, even for parties disinterested in the new region. Prime example being Syria flaring up due to secondary effects from both Israel and Ukraine. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. At the highest level, the possibility of what you might think of as domino effects, that's a real thing, and that's something that I discussed in the video on the Trump doctrine from maybe a week or two ago. The central problem arises when one party is getting weaker as a consequence of fighting a war, at least temporarily, and then a third party wants to take advantage of the situation. The way this connects to the Trump doctrine is the idea that you cannot disaggregate a war between China and Taiwan and a war between Russia and Europe, because the United States has a vested interest in both of those regions. So, for example, if China invades Taiwan, the United States is going to come to Taiwan's defense, but that means that the United States is temporarily enfeebled in its ability to intervene in a war in Europe. So Russia, recognizing the opportunity, decides to fight a war in Europe under favorable circumstances. Hence, we have the phrase wars of opportunism. So, yes, this is a real problem. As for the comments regarding uncertainty, the relationship there is far more ambiguous, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, even in a vacuum of two countries negotiating with one another and not worrying about third-party incentives, it actually is not the case that increasing uncertainty increases the probability of war. It is true in the extremes. If you look at a case with complete information and compare it to a case with incomplete information, you will get that sort of result. To be a little bit more detailed on what I mean there, if you think about your just traditional standard crisis bargaining model without any commitment problems and without any uncertainty, well, there's a bargaining range, and so the parties should be settling inside of that. If you compare that to a circumstance where there is some sort of uncertainty, then we also know that there is a risk of miscalculation, and under those circumstances, you can get war. And thus, compare the two extremes: standard crisis bargaining model with no uncertainty, no war; standard crisis bargaining with uncertainty, yeah, you could get war. It seems like you have the relationship as described in the question. However, the actual relationship is more ambiguous than that. I will try to give you the high-level explanation of it here, but bear in mind that I spend a ton of time in my academic crisis bargaining textbook on the subject, so this is fairly complicated, so don't think that you're going to get the full picture from just talking about this in the next 30 seconds or so in a basic Q&A video. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the mechanism that causes war with uncertainty. Imagine that I am the uncertain party, and I have to make a proposal to my opponent. Well, the way that war occurs here is if I have undue optimism about how much I can extract out of my opponent. In other words, I think that my opponent is fairly weak with a high degree of probability, and so I'm going to make an onerous demand out of my opponent, recognizing that there is some chance that that is going to be rejected by a stronger opponent, but that chance is relatively low as compared to the high degree of likelihood that I am facing a relatively weak type, and I can extract a lot out of them. All right, well, let's try to operationalize what uncertainty is under the circumstance. Imagine that there's just a binary possibility from my perspective, that the opponent is either weak or strong on two opposite poles, and there is no other possibilities in the middle. So it's either weak, strong, one or two, no third option, no fourth option, no infinitely many possible options between those two extremes. Well, then uncertainty maximizes when it's a 50-50 chance that I'm facing a weak type or a strong type. You can think about why that might be the case if you understand Bernoulli distributions and what the variance is in the Bernoulli distribution, but just have some more intuition about this sort of thing. When I'm 99.99% sure I'm facing one type, that is relative certainty, as compared to 50-50 where I could not go any further not knowing which one I'm facing. Given that, it is possible that I might want to make a safe demand out of my opponent, especially if I have high costs of war. If I have very high costs of war, then a 50% chance likelihood that a strong opponent is going to reject my proposal is something that is very scary to me, and so I am going to make a relatively small demand out of my opponent, knowing that both weak and strong opponents are willing to accept that. Thus, in the case of maximal uncertainty, we get peace. Well, what happens if we reduce the uncertainty? One way to reduce uncertainty is to increase the likelihood that I think that I am facing a weak type. Again, because a 99.99% chance that I'm facing a weak type has more uncertainty associated with it than a 50-50 shot. Okay, but that means that there's some likelihood I'm facing the weak type where suddenly I become willing to make the aggressive demand, and an onerous demand out of my opponent, to get only the weak type to accept, realizing that I'm going to be fighting a war against a stronger opponent, but that the likelihood of that is relatively small. Where exactly that cut point is going to fall will depend on a whole bunch of other parameters. But for the sake of this argument, imagine that it's at 75%. In other words, if I think that there is a 75% chance I am facing the weak opponent, then that is when I switch to making the aggressive demand. Well, that also implies that there's a 25% chance of me fighting a war now. I have gone from a circumstance of maximal uncertainty and zero probability of war. I have decreased my uncertainty. I've become more certain about what the opponent is that I'm facing, but that has made me more inclined to make more aggressive demands, which then can get rejected. Now, aside from that, I don't think that the person who asked this question is wrong in saying that it is fully possible that a war in one region can increase uncertainty in other regions. But that's not always going to be the case either. You could think about a circumstance where one party is unsure about whether a country like, say, Pakistan is going to intervene in some other conflict down the line. Well, if Pakistan is incredibly busy fighting a war in India, it removes the uncertainty about Pakistan intervening in this other conflict. Pakistan's not going to because it's too busy fighting the war with India. So that actually resolves uncertainty under those sorts of circumstances. And even if you're thinking about the extreme examples of complete information versus incomplete information, it is possible that having this extra war being fought in the world is going to reduce uncertainty and make things better in that way as well. Is there a reason why global tension is rising all at the same time? Or is it just a coincidence? Right now, at least for the conflicts that we're seeing, I think it's more of the second question. It's just a coincidence. Obviously, that could change if we see more conflicts going on in the world, especially as it relates to China and Taiwan. And I've been struggling to describe exactly what is going on here, because this is a topic that I want to have as my next main video on the main channel. And the way that I have settled on trying to describe this is that we are currently a world at war. We are not in a world war. And what I mean by that is in a world war, you have relatively clean battle lines being drawn of a coalition on one side fighting another coalition on a different side. And here, we don't really quite have that. We have pockets of conflict around the world. We have Russia and Ukraine. We have Israel and a bunch of guys. We have now Pakistan and India, possibly. There is, of course, still the tensions in the Indo-Pacific region with China and Taiwan and a whole bunch of East Asian allies there as well. But you don't have this interconnectivity of all of the conflicts going on at once. But that is not to say that a conflict in one area is not having run-on effects elsewhere. And I think we've seen that most clearly with the artillery shell shortage. There's only so many 155mm shells out there in the world right now. There's only so many that can be produced in any given month. And when we have more and more of these wars being fought, especially in cases like Israel and Ukraine, who both want 155mm shells especially, well, that gets you into these issues where, yeah, having a war going on in Europe is affecting Israel's ability to get those shells, and vice versa. And it will be all the worse if Taiwan actually starts getting involved in an active conflict. And even aside from Taiwan being involved in an active conflict, as we talked about with the Trump doctrine, Trump and his administration wants to get as much of those shells into Taiwan ahead of time, which means they have to do it right now because getting them into Taiwan once a war has started is going to be far more difficult than it is if you try to do it proactively. But at least for now, those are more like logistical questions rather than the questions of how one team fights another team, as we saw in World War I and World War II. At what point does a skirmish or standoff between two countries become a war? What criteria would need to be met for the current crisis between India and Pakistan to be considered a war? Intensity of conflict, number of casualties, length of conflict, none of the above? Well, I can give you a relatively clean answer to that. It's 1,000 battle deaths. The most prominent dataset on wars in international relations is called Correlates of War. 1,000 battle deaths is the threshold there. There are also some other criteria about there being balance between the two sides fighting, and also it being a continual fight rather than, well, we fought one day for a couple of battle deaths, then 2 months later 100 people died, then 3 months later 300 people died, and so forth. That's not a sustained conflict. This has to be sustained conflict, getting 1,000 battle deaths for it to be declared a war. Now, there isn't a particularly good scientific reason why we're having 1,000 battle deaths be the threshold. It just sounded like a pretty good round number when the political scientists who were coding this many decades ago had to have some sort of line between what is just an ordinary dispute between states and war, and they just so happened to choose 1,000 battle deaths. I will say, though, that 1,000 battle deaths is pretty good at hitting everything that one might learn in a high school civics class about a particular country. What I mean by that is if you go through the Correlates of War list of wars, unless you are someone who is super into military history, there will be entries into that dataset that you have never heard of before. But if you grew up in Peru and you took a high school civics class on Peruvian history, you would see all of the things that you have learned in that class show up in that dataset. Likewise, if you grew up in, say, New Zealand, you would be familiar with all of the conflicts that New Zealand was in. Or if you grew up in Egypt, you would be familiar with all of the wars that are listed inside of the Correlates of War dataset involving Egypt. And the reason I think that 1,000 battle deaths is not ultimately that bad of a threshold is that if you look into the alternative dataset, that's called militarized interstate disputes, which includes things that have less than 1,000 battle deaths, and in many cases, no battle deaths at all, there are going to be plenty of entries where even if you grew up in the country, and even if you are relatively knowledgeable in conflict, you will have never heard of them before. So even I, as an American who studies this sort of thing regularly, and has opened up the militarized interstate dispute dataset many times before in his life, if I went to it right now, and I filtered for disputes that the United States was involved in, and I made this a little bit easier on myself, and restricted it to only disputes where there were fatalities, there are going to be a whole bunch of those that I have never heard of before. So I think when we are thinking about wars, having a qualification of people are aware of this thing is pretty important for something to qualify actually as a war. So as of right now, India and Pakistan not currently involved in a war, could be eventually involved in a war. That's something that you have to code retrospectively, and obviously let's hope that we not get to that point because it would require 1,000 battle deaths. Are India's and Pakistan's nuclear arsenals enough to wipe out each other's populations, size and topology of each country in mind? Well, good news, bad news. The good news is that there are only 350 nuclear weapons between them, and I hope you heard my air quotes when I said only there. By comparison, they don't have the same level of tens of thousands of nuclear weapons that the United States and the Soviet Union had during the Cold War, where having a reasonable conversation about the complete destruction of the United States or the complete destruction of the Soviet Union was something worth having a conversation about, especially because US and Soviet nuclear weapons were more powerful than the nuclear weapons that Pakistan and India have. So the good news is that even in a worst-case scenario where you do have a full-scale nuclear war between the two parties, something named Pakistan and something named India will survive and persist after that nuclear war. But obviously, the way that those countries are going to be functioning afterward and what they will look like afterward is going to be completely different from what they look like now. It will be the most destructive event in the history of mankind by far. It would be an absolute tragedy. It's the type of thing that everyone should be relatively scared about, even if you're not in this particular country, even if you're not India, even if you're not in Pakistan. You still have to worry about it because this is a huge number of human beings that would be killed in the event of a nuclear war. But for however reassuring this is, they still will exist. There still will be Pakistanis alive, and there still will be Indians alive afterward. Sure, all of this talk of nuclear strategy, but who has the bigger button? That would be India. India, we think, has 10 more nuclear weapons than Pakistan. And I should point out, also in regard to the previous question, the 350 nuclear weapons overall and the 10 more that India has, those are just guesses that the intelligence communities have about this sort of thing. It's not something that we know for sure. The only people that probably really know this are going to be deep inside of the Indian government and deep inside the Pakistani government. But it's fair to assume that India likely has more nuclear weapons. One thing that we can be more confident about is that India's nuclear weapons are slightly more powerful with their plutonium designs as compared to Pakistan's uranium-based designs. That said, if I were sitting in India right now, I would not take much comfort from this. It turns out that Pakistan's largest cities really fall off after the top two. You have Karachi, and then you have Lahore, and then there's a massive population drop-off until you get to the next largest city, the third largest city. And in comparison, India has a whole bunch of really, really large cities, and thus, from Pakistan's perspective, many, many very attractive targets inside of India. Even if their weapons are slightly less powerful, if you're targeting a nuclear weapon at a larger city, because India has so many large cities, the amount of damage that Pakistan can create with their relatively small nuclear weapon might actually end up being more than one of India's relatively large nuclear weapons. So, sure, size matters when you're looking at nuclear arsenals, but it also matters in terms of what you're targeting with them. More general, and probably dumb question. Trust me when I say that there are plenty of dumb questions out there, and this is not one of them. A question on the non-proliferation regime. Recognized nuclear powers are banned from tests that would signal to opponents the viability of their weapons, reducing the risk of miscalculation, causing a first strike and a nuclear war. What has replaced that today, and how does nuclear testing from recognized states affect the non-proliferation system and the risk of war? Well, like I said, I don't think that this is a dumb question, but there are parts of it that are misinformed. So let me explain what's going on here and why talking about this I think is relevant, which is why this question is a good question overall, ultimately. So if this is your question, please don't feel bad about anything I'm saying. The heart of this question is good, and that's really the important thing here. As a starting point, there actually isn't some sort of test ban treaty in the way that is described in this question. There is something called the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. There are countries that have signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but not enough countries have signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is in effect. So if we're purely looking at this from a legal standpoint, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which would ban all tests of nuclear weapons, hence Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, it's got a fitting name given the circumstances, that is still not going to prevent anyone, legally speaking, from testing a nuclear weapon. Aside from that, India and Pakistan are not signatories to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, so if it did come into force tomorrow, there still wouldn't be anything stopping India and Pakistan from testing because they have not obligated themselves to not test. Okay, now shifting away from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, there is another treaty out there called the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which, as the name suggests, is not a comprehensive test ban, but limits the types of tests that you can do. And in particular, the big thing that it stops countries from doing who have signed this treaty is it stops above-ground testing of nuclear weapons. So if you want to test a nuclear weapon, according to the Partial Test Ban Treaty, you're free to do so, you just have to do it underground. The reason that that treaty came into force is because it turns out that when you launch a bunch of nuclear weapons or you just detonate a bunch of nuclear weapons, that is going to put a whole bunch of radiation into the atmosphere that is measurable, it is detectable, it can cause cancer. It's not likely to cause cancer, but if you have, say, 7 or 8 billion people in the world, even a very small percentage chance that you'll get cancer as a consequence of a nuclear test is still going to kill a lot of people. That is why the Partial Test Ban Treaty came into existence. And even countries that have not signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, like North Korea still tests its nuclear weapons underground because if you can drill a very large hole, it is better to test your nuclear weapon underground than it is to let that radiation go up into the atmosphere. But let's circle back to the point about legally speaking versus practically speaking. Laws in international relations, as you know, are laws, with air quotes. They don't have some sort of third-party independent enforcement that is going to come and arrest you if you break one of those sorts of rules. So if it is maybe a good idea for a particular country to test a nuclear weapon in a crisis, perhaps like what we're seeing between India and Pakistan, any prior existing treaty, quote, commitment, end quote, is not going to have that much of an effect on their decision, on their calculus, whether to do it or not. And actually, if you think that there is some sort of small cost to breaking the treaty commitment that you have made previously, as this question is talking about, there are signaling effects associated with testing a nuclear weapon. If you test a nuclear weapon, it shows that you mean business in a way that not testing a nuclear weapon would not show. But if there is an additional cost associated with testing a nuclear weapon because you've signed some sort of treaty saying that you're not, then breaking it is actually a stronger signal of your commitment to what's going on here, not the treaty commitment, but rather the crisis and the commitment that you have to winning the crisis. So you might actually get a stronger signaling effect as a consequence of the treaty being signed and then broken. In a video, you seem to suggest a sober perspective about nuclear use in this conflict. Do you think that nuclear war between those two is more likely than not? Or is there a substantial, even if unlikely, possibility of nuclear war in a way not comparable to Russia-Ukraine? And why did you not have such a sobering perspective with Russia and Ukraine on nuclear use? Well, I think the good news here is that the likelihood of a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, defined as any nuclear weapons being used in an offensive capacity, I think it's relatively low. I would put it at less than a 1% chance. I know that in the comment section of the previous video, there were maybe a couple of individuals complaining that I was being an alarmist and saying that we're so many steps away from a nuclear war that I shouldn't be talking about it and I shouldn't be producing videos and it's clickbait. That is a perspective, I guess. I don't think it's a very good one. Even if there is a less than a 1% chance of a nuclear war between the two parties, the consequences of a nuclear war are just so enormous that it's the type of thing that we have to care about, even if it is a very low probability event. And even if you think that the chance is very low, or perhaps it's a 0% possibility, the fact that it could happen, even if it's not going to happen, is still going to influence the outcomes that are associated with this interaction between the two parties. Even if we know for sure that there is a literal 0% chance use of nuclear weapons, part of the reason why there would be a 0% chance of the use of nuclear weapons is that in the event of a war between India and Pakistan, that India would not try to invade Islamabad, which then could provoke a nuclear strike from Pakistan. So even if you literally think that there is a 0% chance of nuclear weapons being used here, you still have to care about nuclear weapons being used to understand the types of settlements or types of outcomes that we're going to be getting between India and Pakistan actively right now. Another way to think about the naivete of that sort of argument is that this type of person who thinks that we shouldn't care about nuclear weapons being used in India and Pakistan would also be the type of person that would tell you that we shouldn't have guards guarding Fort Knox because Fort Knox has never been robbed. Okay, yeah, sure, but the reason that Fort Knox has never been robbed is because it is very well protected. Things that don't happen can still influence the things that you are doing, precisely because the things that you are doing can influence whether things happen or not. I'm not quite sure about the question regarding Ukraine and Russia because I haven't spoken really specifically about that at any point. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about nuclear use. I haven't really drilled down into the alleged report that at one point the United States intelligence community had a 50-50 assessment on whether Russia was going to use nuclear weapons in a tactical way. This was occurring during the Ukrainian offensive in the fall of 2022, when Russia was on its heels both in Kharkiv and in Kherson. Again, I haven't been particularly forthcoming about relative probabilities in this realm, even if I have talked about nuclear weapons use inside of Ukraine. I do think that when I first heard that 50% estimate, that struck me as being very, very high and unreasonably high. But again, I'm not actually inside of the US government seeing the intelligence reports that come in. So maybe that is true, and maybe that is what the intelligence reports were saying. It's also possible that maybe some intelligence reports were saying that from some relative alarmists within the intelligence community, but there were contrary intelligence reports suggesting a relatively lower probability. I don't know about that sort of thing. It's hard for us as outsiders to really grasp that sort of thing. I will say this. If you're someone who lives outside of both of those conflict zones and are not really too concerned about what the outcome of those actually looks like on the ground, maybe, for example, you're from Ghana, you're not in that situation in Europe, you're not in that situation in Asia. The thing that I would still be more concerned about as someone who lives in Ghana, hypothetically, would be India, Pakistan, because the level of damage in India and Pakistan is much larger than what could happen between Russia and Ukraine. With Russia and Ukraine, it would be some sort of Russian tactical nuclear weapons use to try to signal that Russia means business and maybe get some sort of military benefit out of it, as compared to the type of threat that exists in the subcontinent right now between India and Pakistan, where if those two countries get involved in a serious exchange, we're talking about 7 or 8 figures of death. Tens of millions of people potentially dying under those circumstances. That is the bigger threat right now to international security broadly. Again, if you're living in a country that is not directly connected to either of those conflicts. Will nuclear winter offset the effects of global warming? Well, sadly, or happily, depending on your perspective, I guess. As I mentioned earlier, there's just not enough nuclear weapons in India and Pakistan to cause major catastrophic environmental damage like would be the case during the Cold War. So no worries about nuclear winter, just worries about lots of human death and economic suffering. How does a major conflict between India and Pakistan affect China's plans with Russia and Taiwan? Well, there's really not too much of a connection between Russia and China and then India and Pakistan. The most that I could see happening there would involve the fact that Russia exports a lot of oil to India right now. If India and Pakistan were in the middle of a war, that would be more difficult to do, which would mean you would probably see lots more oil going from India instead into China, which would be bad for Russia and good for China. It would be bad for Russia because they're losing another buyer. It would be good for China because China gets oil at cheaper prices. China and Taiwan, as it relates to India, is more interesting. There is a disputed region between China and India. And one thing that Beijing would thus need to be worried about if it ever tried to invade Taiwan and get in a full-scale war with Taiwan and Western partners of Taiwan and Japan and South Korea and all of that, is India is still on China's western flank. And that means that China would have to be worried that India could try to make a move in the disputed region. What is the likelihood that the United States will go to war with China in 2027 or 2028? How does the gradual shift toward domestic chip production in the United States affect those odds? Well, I think if we expand out that timeline a little bit, because trying to forecast a war for a specific year is so difficult that it's borderline a fool's errand. Even if we do expand that out by a couple of years, I still think we're looking at a less than 10% chance of a war between those two parties. Bearing in mind, though, that less than a 10% chance of war between two major powers is still a really big deal, something that we want to avoid. So even if it is less than 10%, we should still care quite a bit about it. The second question, I think, is more interesting, discussing semiconductor production inside of the United States. I think this makes a war between the United States and China less likely, but perversely, the invasion of Taiwan more likely. Let me explain what I mean there. Obviously, the United States and Taiwan have a political connection between the two of them, but the thing that is tangible that is driving the United States' desire to want to defend and protect Taiwan is the economic interdependence between those two countries. The United States needs stable, reliable semiconductor production to do all sorts of things, including the production of this video. I can't film and record this video without the semiconductors that were produced in Taiwan. But if the United States has an ample supply of semiconductors being manufactured domestically, then the economic interdependence between the United States and Taiwan has gone down. Now, to be clear, it would not be erased entirely, because as long as you have a cut in production of semiconductors globally, the prices of semiconductors is going to go up. So the United States would still not like that, because it would make things more expensive to produce. It is just that the United States is not going to be dependent on Taiwan producing those sorts of chips. Well, you cut economic interdependence, you cut the likelihood that the United States is willing to intervene in Taiwan, and thus you cut down the probability that China and the United States go to war. The perverse effect of this, of course, is thinking about what the deterrent from China's perspective is of invading Taiwan. China is going to be looking at the cost of invading Taiwan and the risks associated with invading Taiwan, and a major determinant of that is going to be whether the United States intervenes or not. If the United States is less inclined to intervene, that makes China more inclined to invade Taiwan, and I think as a consequence of that, makes the likelihood of an invasion of Taiwan go up. Then again, the overall effect may not be as obvious as I was making it out to be a moment ago. As we've discussed many times before on the main channel, the main effect of shifting the balance of power between two parties is that you shift the range of settlements that are mutually preferable to war. So just because the United States is no longer around does not mean that Taiwan is going to be invaded. What may end up being the case is that Taiwan has to be more conciliatory to Beijing, which is bad for the West for different reasons, aside from an invasion. What would an extended war between India and Pakistan mean for other countries in the region and global flights/trade? Would the disruption of flights from the European and Gulf countries to Asia eventually make outside actors try to force India and Pakistan into peace? Well, to be blunt, if there were a full-scale war between India and Pakistan, we'd be looking at a supply chain disaster and a global recession. India is a larger economy than Pakistan is by quite a bit, and there's only a few countries that are larger than India, globally speaking. India imports a lot, which means that any country that is importing to India is going to have some of their business cut. But it's much more concerning to me about exports coming out of India, and thus stopping coming out of India if a war starts, because any sort of input product that is made in India will no longer be available, and that has all sorts of domino effects elsewhere in the economy. Think about COVID, but then completely erase the Indian economy from the map. that's the type of supply chain issue that we're going to be seeing. And given all of that, it's hard to imagine that the world avoids a recession, given, again, a full-scale war between India and Pakistan. I do appreciate the sentiment about other countries thinking about the disaster that is happening in this hypothetical, and then trying to resolve the conflict with third-party mediation, some peace subsidies, some conditional threats depending upon whether the actors are continuing in the war or not. But really, the time to do this, to maximize the effectiveness and return on investment, that time is now. It is not after India and Pakistan are already exchanging full-scale blows in a very, very large war that the subcontinent has never seen before. What does the US-UK trade deal tell us about when and how this tariff charade will end? Unfortunately, not very much. The United States and the United Kingdom were engaging in a long conversation about trade policy before the Trump administration and the Liberation Day tariffs came into place, which means that the United States and the United Kingdom were close to being able to sign a deal before any of this happened. So if there is a perception out there that because this deal has been reached, that is a good sign for more deals being reached relatively quickly, the bad news is that the United States and the United Kingdom already had a really good head start on this, and so this is not going to necessarily be reflective of what we'll be seeing elsewhere. Why do you think nothing happened during the parade in Moscow? Everyone expected some kind of move from Ukrainian armed forces, or some kind of sabotage, yet nothing happened. I think the answer is pretty straightforward. The security was too tight. As I mentioned in my video on the 3-day ceasefire, which is totally definitely happening right now, there was a whole lot of risk of collateral damage if Ukraine were to try to make an attack in that area. And so that was already straining the credulity of trying to commit an attack on that particular date. The irony of this is that Ukraine actually did impose a cost, but no one is going to talk about it because there wasn't anything spectacular in terms of explosions. All of the security measures being taken in Moscow today, like shutting off the internet, that has a real economic impact that Ukraine has imposed upon Moscow without actually having to conduct any attack whatsoever. Taking a step back, I think we would all be a lot better off if we just stopped caring about Victory Day. There is way too much discussion about this in Western media circles. I get that had there been an attack on Victory Day this year, that would have been a very high leverage situation. It would have made for lots of headlines, something along the lines of maybe the Kerch Bridge being struck by another missile. But expecting this to happen is something that is going a bit too far. But somehow, every year, Western media circles get enamored with the idea that something important is going to happen as it relates to Victory Day. I remember the first year of the war, not even 3 months into the invasion, there was a serious discussion within Western media that Putin was going to use his platform at the Victory Day parade to declare mission accomplished in Ukraine. They went in there, they did what they needed to do, and that was going to be the end of the war. Ukraine is going to see that this war is over, Russia is now going to withdraw, and we're going to go back to having some sort of status quo ex ante. That was a serious conversation in Western media circles circa May 2022. Last year, there was another serious conversation about how Victory Day was allegedly the target date that Moscow had for Russian troops to capture Pokrovsk. Guess what, guys? It is the year of our Lord 2025, and Russia still has not captured Pokrovsk. That's right, the Pope is American, but Pokrovsk is still Ukrainian. And the notion that 13 or 14 months ago, the Kremlin was ordering Russian troops without any regard to whether this was physically possible or not to rush immediately to Pokrovsk. That was insane. It's still insane today. It was even more insane way back then. And all because Putin wants to have some sort of fancy thing to say during his fancy parade. Well, breaking news once again, guys. It is possible for Putin to have a speech on any other day other than Victory Day, and if he gets to have another speech on another day, that's 2 fancy speeches for him and not just 1. Let it go with the whole Victory Day thing. We need to stop treating Victory Day like it is some sort of major event on the world calendar. It is an important day from a patriot's perspective inside of Russia. Don't get me wrong, that is true, but it's not the be-all, end-all of a situation. Russia is perfectly capable of declaring things on days that are not May the 9th. Turns out there are 364 days out of the year. You can do other things on those days as well. And next year, when it's 2026 and the war is still ongoing, assuming that it is, we would all be a lot better off if we just pretended like Victory Day was just any other day on the calendar, except for me because I can use it to get a lot more stock photos. That's good for me. But for everyone else, ignore it. Pretend like it doesn't exist. If something does happen in 2026 that's interesting, great. Let's talk about it after the fact, but let's not put Victory Day on a pedestal. If you had to speculate, does Ukraine actually want a somewhat acceptable peace agreement, or is their preferred scenario to keep fighting with continued US support? Well, whether you want a peace deal or not depends on what you can get by fighting instead. And if what Ukraine is currently looking at is a pretty bad outcome by fighting because it's not going to have US military support, then sure, Ukraine is happy to have, and I use happy in a relative sense here, is happy to have a deal as compared to a continued war under very bad circumstances. However, I have no doubt that Ukraine would prefer fighting a war under favorable military circumstances. That means US support, and it also means not only the European support that it's currently receiving, but a serious investment that actually follows through inside of Europe of military construction in Europe and military aid to Ukraine from Europe. I have no doubt that Ukraine would prefer fighting under that circumstance than having a deal where Ukraine has to give up a lot of stuff because it does not have the military backing of Western countries. Simultaneously, though, I also have no doubt that even more preferred inside of Kyiv would be for Russia to just leave Ukraine, given that Russia is expecting all of that support from the United States and Europe. But especially in regard to the United States, no one in Moscow is anticipating that the United States is going to be funneling lots and lots of arms into Ukraine. And so that possibility of a peaceful outcome where Ukraine is getting what it wants is just not on the table right now. With such a wide range of acceptable outcomes in war bargaining, what makes any settlement possible at all? What determines which one is decided on? So I think the first question is really being led by the second question, which is that given that there are so many different things, how is it that you end up at one of them and not in some sort of gridlock or deadlock that prevents any deal from happening and instead you just get fighting until one side wins and then implements whatever it wants? It's actually a much deeper conversation in economics known as the bargaining problem. More than a decade ago now, I created a playlist of 30 videos on that subject that helps explain why deals, given that there is a range of them, end up better for you and worse for your opponent, or vice versa. But one thing that's pertinent to international relations specifically is who is actually in status quo possession of the good. Because if I currently control all of the land that's in dispute, and suddenly there is some sort of stochastic shock in the balance of power that leads you to having more power than you had before, which makes the current status quo unacceptable to you, well, because I am in the status quo control of the entire good, I can just retreat back to whatever your reservation value is, whatever your expected outcome of the war is, minus the costs. And the choice that you have at that point is to accept it or get involved in an ugly, messy war, which means that I'm going to do fairly well in that sort of bargaining environment, and you're going to do relatively poorly. In fact, there is an interesting result that says that if you have the ability to choose any way that two parties can negotiate, you and your opponent, with the condition that the opponent is always allowed to reject an offer and fight if it wants to, which is how it works in international relations, no one can stop you from fighting if you really want to, then it is optimal for you to select an ultimatum to the other side, where you make a proposal and the other side can take it or leave it. They can accept the deal and implement it, or they can reject it and fight a war. And that's effectively what retreating to a specific line looks like. You can man that line and say, look, the other half of it, or the other portion of it, whatever portion it may be, that's yours. The rest of it is going to stay as mine. And if you see differently, then you have to fight. You have to fight past this line. You have to start shooting. Well, this paper shows that negotiating in that way is optimal. So if you're in a territorial situation that looks like that, that is how you should negotiate. On a lighter note, what's your favorite Indian or Pakistani food? Answer there is going to be idli Manchurian. You may be somewhat familiar with it because Gobi Manchurian has started to infiltrate a lot of American restaurants, aside from the Indian restaurants inside of the United States. Gobi Manchurian is cauliflower that has been battered and then coated in a sauce, which I think is probably best described as how Indians think of as Chinese food. So imagine what the sauces you might get in Panda Express as an American, but convert that to India, and have Indians making Chinese food for Indians. That's the sauce that is in there. Idli Manchurian makes the slight differentiation of replacing the cauliflower with idli, which is a puffed rice and lentil mix. And it creates this nice crispiness with the frying of it, and then the sauce is delicious. Add some onions, add some peppers, it's great. What have we done to deserve any of this? Well, on one hand, nothing. Bad things sometimes happen. On the other hand, if I can get on my soapbox for a moment, because we have to have one rant per Q&A video, this is going to be that rant. There has been a palpable drop-off in interest in international conflict a couple of times over the last 2 years. And while I am fairly confident I understand why this is the case, bear in mind that I am now speculating. This is not me speaking as someone who is a political scientist and has studied this rigorously and actually knows this to be the answer. But I believe what is going on here is that people really only like to hear good news and only have interest in listening to things that are going on in the international relations world if they are interesting and good. The problem with that, of course, is that bad things happen in the world, and if we're not vigilant in trying to do things to stop those bad things from happening, well, we're opening ourselves up to even more bad things happening. Now, I'm probably speaking to the choir here because you are on a secondary channel of a national security channel, which means you have a natural interest in national security already. You probably subscribe to the original channel. If you haven't, please do. You probably subscribe to this channel. If you haven't, please do. You're the type of person that's just really interested in this. So you are probably not the problem, but the people maybe in your social circles that you talk to a lot about this, but who are not particularly interested in it and who are only paying attention when the good things are happening, those people tend to be the problem here. And I can point to a couple of different breakpoints where you can really see the difference. First is in the middle of 2023 after Prigozhin's Thunder Run. That obviously had a lot of international interest because it was really, really interesting, obviously. And also because it's a high leverage situation and it was good news for the United States and for the West as a whole. That, however, failed because, to be clear, Prigozhin had a huge miscalculation where he thought that this was going to turn out okay if he called a timeout, which ended up not being okay at all. But I could feel a palpable, I keep using that word, but I think it's the right word, a palpable letting out of the air, so to speak. Everything kind of became deflated after that. It seemed like the moment where all of the West's grand plans were going to culminate, that the Western countries had done enough to support Ukraine, to sow enough discord inside of Russia, that Russia was just going to fall apart via civil war, assassinations, or otherwise. And that as a result of that, Ukraine was going to be able to have a cakewalk to victory and end the war in a way that was going to be very favorable to Kyiv. You might even remember the videos of Ukrainian soldiers popping popcorn and watching what was going on. But then, of course, Prigozhin turns around, and then you have the deflation like I was talking about, where people just now think that it's not happening and maybe we should stop caring and focusing on it anymore. Then, more recently, you have the Trump administration coming into office and all of the discord inside of the Western circles, which again is something that people really are not particularly excited to hear about, and thus they are not interested in learning more about it and thinking about what to do under these sorts of circumstances. So to get back to the question, what have we done to deserve any of this? If we think of we not as you and me, not as myself as the producer of this video and all of you guys listening to it, but rather we as a collective, all of humanity, what we have done to deserve this is to only be interested in the news when it's good news and not be willing to stick it out and problem solve when we encounter the bad news. And that, incidentally, is also what separates good grad students from bad grad students. If you give me two students, one of which is more capable and is rarely ever stuck, and another student who is stuck much more often, but this other student, the one that gets stuck more often, is also the type of person who finds getting stuck itself to be interesting. And when they encounter that sort of adversity, they're incentivized to keep going and keep fighting to figure out a solution to it. That's the type of person that is going to do better in grad school, as compared to a student who is not stuck very often, but when they are stuck, they just give up. My country was handed to a clown with a circus. I'm too embarrassed for questions. You know, that really doesn't narrow down which country you live in. How will the fact that the Pope is American affect global politics? It probably won't too much, other than I could imagine it getting further under Trump's skin if the Pope criticizes the Trump administration for any of the policies that it's trying to implement both at home or abroad. I could see that getting to be more irritating for the Trump administration than the same criticism from a Pope that's from Italy, for example. As an American, how did you come to know so much about cricket, and what are your thoughts on it? Well, I really liked baseball for the vast majority of my life. But let's face it, baseball is kind of boring. And after watching, I would say, maybe only 2 or 3 cricket matches, I realized that cricket scratches the same itch as baseball does, but is much more exciting. And to be fair, baseball has gotten better since Major League Baseball implemented a pitch clock, but even then, it's still the case that cricket is more exciting, especially when you're in the 20th over and you need to score, say, 20 runs in that 20th over, and you're basically playing what would be a baseball equivalent of home run derby toward the end of it. That is extremely exciting, and it's the type of thing that baseball rarely ever has. Who is this episode's sponsor? Today's video is sponsored by French Toast. Eat it whenever you feel like it. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.